Would you pray with me? May the words of my mouth and the meditations of all our hearts be pleasing in your sight. For you, O Lord, are our rock and our Redeemer. Amen. All right, this is the last week of our Unwrapping Christmas sermon series. So we've spent the last 3 weeks talking about things that we sometimes believe are true about the Christmas story, but are perhaps, in fact, legends or myths that have grown up around it. And so the first week, we talked about the donkey. Now, we all love that beautiful donkey, don't we? He makes a great image for Christmas cards. And in the nativity set, he starred in his own movie last year. I don't know if you got to see that. There's an amazing cartoon called The Star that had the donkey in it. And he's adorable. But as it happens, the Gospels didn't think that he was adorable enough to put him in there. So Luke, as he was writing his story, didn't actually include the donkey. Now, then the second week, we talked about the innkeeper. And again, the innkeeper is this beautiful, beloved character who is the only one in all of Bethlehem that makes room for Jesus and for Joseph and Mary and the Holy Family. And we talk about how important it is to make room in our hearts for Christ. But again, as important as that character has become in our stories, the Gospels don't actually mention him. And in fact, when it says there is no room at the inn, we think that phrase is better translated, there is no room in the guest room. Then, last week, we talked about this beautiful verse, a beloved verse that you probably all know, that says, "Little Lord Jesus, no crying he makes." And it's a beautiful verse, right? But it's not from either of the Gospels that talk about the Christmas story. It is from Away in a Manger. Verse 2 of Away in a Manger, as it happens. And so last week we talked about how Jesus was 100% divine and therefore perfect. And we believe that and hold that. But we also believe that he was 100% human, which means that he was a real baby, and he did what real babies do, which is cry, right? Last week, if you were downstairs, you learned, as I had researched, that real newborn babies tend to cry about 37% of the time that they're awake. That's more than a third of the time that they're awake. So learning all of these things, though, about the Christmas story, that it may not have been the way that my children's pageants went when I was growing up, it was a hard thing to learn. And I think that this is really why we wanted to share it with you, not because we wanted to ruin your Christmas by saying those things aren't true, but by saying that when the story in your head doesn't match the reality, that God is still there. And I've been saying this over and over again, but I really want you to hear it, because I don't care so much about what you think about who was there first and how all of the characters looked in the nativity scene. What I really want you to know is that when the story in your head, you know that story that says, if I work really hard, and if I'm a good person, and if I pray just right, then God will give me everything that I want, and life should be smooth sailing. When that story in your head doesn't quite work out the way that you want, I want you to know that God's still there, right? That even if there are bumps in the road, even when life gets topsy-turvy, even when things go differently than you anticipate, that God is still there in the center of that story. So that's the ultimate goal from this sermon series. So today's myth that we are unwrapping has to do with the kings. And there's going to be a whole lot of unwrapping that we're going to do. So hang on your hats, right? The first thing that we need to know is that in the Bible, in Matthew's story, you can look up Matthew chapter 2 right now if you want. There are no kings. What? No kings. It's listed as Magi, which is translated to wise men. So you may be asking, well, how did they get to be called kings? And I am so glad you asked me that because I've been researching. And I found out that the king's title came about as early as the 2nd century. It was probably Tertullian, a Christian theologian and author, that first gave the kings, or the Magi, the name of kings. So it comes about from 2 sets of prophecy that are found in the Old Testament. First, Psalm 72, that says, the kings of Sheba and Seba present him with gifts. So Tertullian thought that these visitors from the east that were well dressed were probably kings to fulfill this prophecy. Another prophecy comes from Isaiah 60, and it says, the kings will come to the brightness of your dawn. And so Tertullian started calling them kings, and others called them kings, and we still have in our head the word kings. Part of that also comes from John Henry Hopkins Jr., who was looking for a song for the Christmas pageant at his church in Pennsylvania, and he penned then the words of We Three Kings. So Tertullian and John Henry Hopkins Jr. called them kings, but John Calvin, during the Reformation, wrote this. He said that anyone who would label them 3 kings is, and this is his quote, beyond all doubt they have been stupefied by a righteous judgment of God, that all might laugh at their gross ignorance. That's my Calvin voice. Do you like it? That all might laugh at their ignorance. Calvin said, you're a total idiot if you call them kings. But I have to tell you, being a Methodist and not a Presbyterian, I don't really care what Calvin said. So I've never been terribly troubled by Calvin's writing, so you can go right ahead and call them kings if you desire. The Magi, though, is the name that Matthew, again, in his gospel, gives the 3 visitors. Magi means wise men, and what they were advisors to the kings of Persia and Babylon, of Egypt. We see them appear in the story of Daniel. When they were advising the king, we see wise men in various roles. What they were was astrologers, very likely. They studied the stars in order to predict the future, and when they looked at the stars and they followed the patterns, the rise and fall of stars, and they tracked the different constellations, they felt that they could predict the future, and so then they would use that information to advise the king that they were employed underneath. So that's who the Magi were. Now, there weren't necessarily 3 of them either, and Pastor Don did a great job telling the kids that. We know that there were 3 gifts, but we don't know exactly how many people that came. They very likely traveled, as most people did, in a caravan of people, and so there could have been quite a few people that traveled to Bethlehem in that time, in that caravan. So then we get down to the star. Now, I have quite a lot of information about the star. I saw when I was in high school, and then I saw it several other times, a show at the Adler Planetarium in Chicago that was incredibly fascinating. It told all about the star, and it looked at the way that the planets moved. And so first, let me say, the star that they followed could well have been a mystical star that God gave just to the wise men, and only they followed it. This makes sense in some ways because Herod and his advisors, when they get to Jerusalem, the wise men show up in Jerusalem and they say, "Where's the newborn king?" Herod doesn't know, and his advisors don't know. They don't seem to have any knowledge of this star. So it could have been just something that God put in the sky for them. It could have been a comet or a supernova. That's also a possibility, but that seems unlikely given that no one else recorded the event. The Chinese were great astronomers, and they have incredible star charts that go way, way, way back. but they did not record a supernova at that time. Neither did the Greeks or the Romans. So we think it's probably something else. Now, some scholars, and this is what the people who put this video together at the Adler Planetarium said, some people say that it was a conjunction of two planets. So the way that, and you probably know this maybe, the way that the planets orbit the Earth isn't in a perfect circle that always stays constant. It's more of oval shapes that the planets travel, and as they're traveling in their oval shapes, sometimes it appears that they come very, very close to each other as they wander the night sky. And when this happened, astrologers who are trying to predict the future from the skies would look at these two planets coming very close, and they'd say something big is about to happen. And so when we look back at the Chinese star charts, what we see is that Jupiter and Venus came very close together in the 1st century, right about the time that Jesus was born. And it happened 3 times over in a way that would have caused anyone studying the stars to say something big is about to happen. And it happened in the constellation of Leo the Lion. So Jupiter is represented kingship, and Venus represented birth. And Leo the Lion was one of the few constellations that the Jewish people would have recognized. So because the Jews believed in the God of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob, our God, they believed that God created the stars, but didn't necessarily put the future in the stars, right? So they wouldn't have been paying attention, which makes sense why Herod didn't know about it. But the Magi, who maybe had instructions from Daniel, knew that Leo the Lion of Judah, was one of the few constellations that they knew about. And so when this conjunction happens in Leo the Lion, they know that something big is going to happen, and they travel across the desert to see this new king that has been born. I think that's mostly what I need to tell you. So it happened 3 times. Matthew says that the star disappeared for a while, and then it returned. The last time the conjunction happened was in the southern sky, right in the direction of Bethlehem. So we think that that would have led them right there. Now, the last major issue with this story, as we normally tell it, is the timing. So I'm going to come over here, and I want to show you this half of the nativity is from Luke's gospel. All of the shepherds and the stable and Mary and Joseph, the manger part, this is all from Luke chapter 2. And this part with the kings and the Magi, or this is from Matthew's gospel, also in chapter 2. And what we think happened, if you keep reading Matthew chapter 2, Herod hears about this new king, and then he begins to get jealous, and he goes to Bethlehem and has them slaughter all of the baby boys who are 2 and under. So what we think is that the Magi may have come when Jesus was a bit older, perhaps a toddler, perhaps as old as 2. So this part happened first, and then this part could have happened as long as 2 years later, that they came and they found Jesus. So here's where we are. Are you ready? They were not kings, they were astrologers. There were not 3, there were probably more. It might not have been a star, could have been planets. And they didn't arrive when Jesus was in the manger. That's a lot of changes to the Christmas pageant, isn't it? A lot of different things. Are you guys doing okay? Holding with me, tracking together? It's a lot of changes. Matthew's fairly vague. He leaves a lot of mystery in the actual details. But there's still some good things that we can learn from this story, some important things that we need to learn from this story. And they are these. 3 things that I'll suggest to you. 1, that astrology surrenders to Christ. So I told you that the Magi are wise men, much like the wise men and the advisors that threw Daniel in the lion's den. They're the same sort of advisors that might have been around when Joseph, with his Technicolor dream coat, had to come and interpret the dreams for Pharaoh. And in every case in the Bible, whether it was Joseph in the dream coat, or whether it was Daniel in the lion's den, or whether it's the Magi at Jesus' birth, in every case, the astrologers bend to God's will and God's design of the universe. Isn't that interesting? That always God seems to be at work shaping the trajectory of the universe in the midst of the stars and the other ways that they interpreted it. Then, secondly, we see the dividing walls between races and cultures begin to break down as soon as Jesus enters the world. We see that foreigners are welcome. If you were to read Matthew 1, it's a bit of a slow read, so God bless you as you read it. But it's got a lot of names, and they're really good names. And someday, Pastor Don, we need to do a sermon just on Matthew chapter 1, because it's really good stuff. But in those names, you'll see people from places outside of Israel. You'll see how God wove in the stories of foreigners, of people who had made some pretty serious mistakes. And they're all there as a part of Jesus' family tree. And so what we learn is that God takes people from outside of the box, outside of what we consider normal, and says, you too are a part of this story. You men from the East, you astrologers who follow a different kind of religion, you too are here at Jesus' birth, and you too have a place in the gospel grace. Finally, we learn that we are to respond to a divine call. The Magi knew that they were supposed to go see a new king, and they went. And here's what I think is interesting, and you may have noticed this before, that the Magi show up in Jerusalem, and they say, King Herod, where's the new baby? And he says, I don't know, let's ask my advisors. And they say, oh, the new Messiah is supposed to be born in Bethlehem. It's in Micah 5:2. And then Herod and his advisors go back to whatever it is that they were doing before the wise men showed up, and the Magi go on to Bethlehem. Don't you think that's interesting? That Herod and his advisors, who have all of the Old Testament at their disposal, sit in their palace. They aren't even willing to travel 5.5 miles. They could have gotten there in a day's journey. And the Magi from the east, they traveled for months to get to see this king. They're willing to do whatever it takes to see Jesus. And Herod and his advisors, they don't even go 5 miles to see what God is up to. So we see that we are called to get going when we hear God's call. That the dividing walls between races and cultures are broken down, and that astrology, everything, surrenders to the grace of Christ. Now, as we close, I want to look back at that passage we read earlier from 1 Corinthians. This is our theme for the week, that we are to find love in the midst of the Christmas story. That love is found in actions, in what we do, and even in what we do not do. 1 Corinthians reminds us that love is not envious or boastful, that it calls us to go to new places and makes us risk takers. Herod was not full of love in, really any story that you can find about him. Herod was envious. He was boastful. He built all of these huge palaces, these huge, enormous structures, and said, look at me. And when he found out that there might be a new king that could possibly take over for him, he wanted to have him slaughtered. Herod was envious and boastful, but the Magi were not. They sought to follow the prophecy to its end, to add depth to their knowledge. Matthew doesn't tell us what they said as they encountered Jesus. We don't know what emotions they had as they rode back home, but we do know that they took great risks. They gave lavish gifts, and that when they saw the star again after it had disappeared, they were overwhelmed with joy. At the Adler Planetarium, that show that I've been quoting from, it ended by saying something along these lines. Isn't it amazing, all the ways that God uses to display his glory in the world? Now, that's not an exact quote because I don't remember the exact words, but what I remember from it is that I was amazed that at this secular place in the middle of Chicago where they were talking about stars, that they said out loud, God is at work in all sorts of ways. And I held on to that, and I'm still holding on to that, because this is what the story of the Magi teaches us, that God is at work in our world. That God wove this whole crazy story together, a story that moves from Nazareth to Bethlehem and back, a story that draws together the poorest of the poor and the wealthy and the wise. Even if it didn't happen on the same night, God brought them all to Jesus. And this is a story where angel armies come out and put on a great display to say that God is here. This is a story of God transformed and becoming human so that we could hear and understand God's great words of love. This is a story of how love came down at Christmas. So let us remember as we go into the world that we don't celebrate Christmas because of angels and donkeys and kings and innkeepers. We don't celebrate this peculiar story because we thought it'd make a great play or awesome paintings for Christmas cards. We celebrate this story and we tell it over and over and over and over because Jesus' birth is the story of how love came into our world and is helping us know without a shadow of a doubt that God is here and God can do anything. Amen.